Hello, everyone. I am Kevin Gallagher again, back with another installment of the Aces Jiu-Jitsu Club podcast series, interview series we've been running with Aces Jiu-Jitsu Club. And today I have, one of my favorite people to talk to. I'm sure that he doesn't need much of an introduction. If you don't know who Robert Drysdale is, and you not know much about jiu-jitsu, in my opinion, maybe you're not paying attention too much. But he is not only a legendary figure of the jiu-jitsu community, legendary competitor, he is also quite the jiu-jitsu historian. Finishing up his documentary on opening the closed guard and just releasing his book that accompanies the documentary Open Closed Guard, which I am about 100 pages into, and it is amazing. If you haven't read it yet, you haven't started yet, we're going to have another podcast where we talk about the entirety of the book when I finish it. So we're going to get to that eventually. But today I have Mr. Robert Drysdale on. I think we're going to talk a little bit about some IBJJF and leg locks and all the fun stuff that come with that. But first of all, thank you very much for coming on the show. Thank you.
No, thank you, Kevin. Thank you for the kind words. Yeah, man, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and share some of my experience and insights with you guys.
Yeah, man. We communicated quite a bit. I wrote an article on the IBJJF leg lock situation, and we talked. It was fun to talk to because I love picking your brain on your knowledge of jiu-jitsu history, because it's somewhat of a murky background, a lot of the oral histories and things. And that's one of my favorite parts about the book that I've been passionate over, is the fact that, the history of jiu-jitsu isn't as cutting dry as people would like to think it is. It has a lot to do with who was in charge while the history was being written. And, one of those concepts is leg locks. But talk a little bit about how the history of jiu-jitsu isn't necessarily as obvious as people might want to think it is.
I think any history is complex, right? We tend to simplify things because the truth of the matter is we're all too busy with our life to dig into hundreds and hundreds of pages of academic research. And so we just take people's account for granted. So if, your instructor tells you this is what happened because that's what he heard from his instructor and that's what he heard from his instructor, most people just go, okay, that must be true, because if everyone's believing it and everyone's saying more or less the same thing, well, there's a reason why that story hasn't been questioned, so therefore it must be the truth, right? And it's just too hard to dig into stuff and really, try to find out how things occurred. But no history is simple. So the history of jiu-jitsu is far richer than people think it is. I think that, we were given an account that is not necessarily incorrect. It's more that it's very incomplete. I think that's the way I like to describe what Brazilian jiu-jitsu history is that it's much better. It's the story of globalization. It's the story of Japanese immigration. It's the story of rivalries, of ambition, of we're going to make it. We're going to make something different. We don't care what the cost is. And, many props to the Gracie family. A lot of people think that they presume that our documentary is an anti-Gracie piece automatically, right? Because some of what was said is just factually incorrect. We know that. Like, there's no such thing as a Gracie Academy in 1925, for example. Right, we know these things for a fact, and they're not up to debate. But they deserve credit for other reasons that, in my opinion, are far more important than the reasons the reasons they gave themselves credit for, which was creating something new, which they didn't do. They didn't create anything new, but what they did do is they kept the martial element of judo alive. They kept the combat, self-defense / real fighting element of martial art of judo alive at a time where judo just became more and more of an Olympic sport and very, very prestigious. So they were winning. They didn't feel like they had to change anything. And the Gracie family stuck to their vision. Like they're very adamant about doing things the way they wanted to do it. And by doing that, they carved a space outside of judo. And I think they completed judo in some ways. I think judo in some ways became deficient because they ruled out so much of ground fighting that it was what I call self-regulation impoverished it. Right? They've created so many rules, and you can't do this and you can't do that, and I think that the martial art lost. And where the Gracie family comes in is they come in with a different vision. They come in and go, no, this is how we're going to do things. And you got to remember too, the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. I mean, other than the fight between Helio and Kimura, which is this huge moment for Helio Gracie in Brazil, other than that, jiu-jitsu is practically dead in Brazil. Like, no one knows what it is. No one's practicing. No one's training. No one cares. And it wasn't until Hoist Gracie came about that they had this like their second great moment, after the Kimura, the big moment there, and then Hoist Gracie 93, and here we are. But, it takes a lot of commitment to stick to something when no one actually pays any attention to what you're doing, and there's no money to be made from it. And there wasn't, so there's, I think for that, they deserve a lot of credit, so, but it's a very rich history. And I hope that comes across in the book, because in the film, there's only so much we can get into a film format. So I think, once you finish, I think that the richness of the story will come across in a way that it hadn't been told before.
Yeah, I mean, I am loving the book. I absolutely, completely love it. It's changing my complete idea of what I believed I thought jiu-jitsu was about. And I believed myself to be somewhat of a nerd on the topic, to have an understanding, being a black belt and training for a while and all that stuff like that. But listening to someone that's actually researched the topic and gone through and talked to people that were alive when it happened and following the actual timeline of events and realizing the jiu-jitsu was, it was a Japanese art that turned into judo, that then when they brought it into America, it had this whole mysterious kind of feel to it. And then listening to the way the old instructors taught, like there wasn't really a curriculum. There wasn't really anything involved with the art of jiu-jitsu, which is this guy from Japan kind of did a little bit of this, a little bit of catch wrestling, a little bit of self-defense from the feudal days. It carried over and so on and so forth. And then it became what the art is today, particularly when we talked about Carlson Gracie. That's the article. That's the whatchamacallit, the chapter I just finished, by the way, talking about Carlson Gracie, how he solidified Carlos Gracie, how he solidified what jiu-jitsu would become into the future.
Yeah, I actually call Carlos Gracie Jr. the president of IBJJF. I know this is not going to be a popular position, but I actually think he's more important to the history of jiu-jitsu than his father was. Hate IBJJF or not, it's not to the point, is that they become the face of the sport and they have give the sport structure. Now, is it perfect? It never is. I don't think Kodokan was perfect either, but Kodokan, what they did for judo is they created this glue, this cohesiveness that is judo, that is over 100 years old and it's still lasting. And I don't think judo is a fad. I think judo will be around forever, man. I don't think they're going anywhere, right? And the idea is for us to create the same things with jiu-jitsu. And the way to do that is through unity, and it's for us to agree. We're not going to agree on everything, but we're going to have to agree on some things, right? And whether we like it or not, the IBJJF incorporates that unity. I think that what 100 years from now, when we're studying the history of jiu-jitsu, we're going to study 1994 as like a turning point in the history of Brazilian jiu-jitsu. It's a very big moment, more than people realize. Not just Hoist Gracie in 93, but the inception of CBJJ, later IBJJF in 94. It's a very big moment for the sport, and that's when the sport really starts evolving technically in a way that it had never done before. Because up to then, they were doing basically judo. It was straight out in the waza. There was not a lot of innovation, and because there was no internet, few schools, few practitioners, few competitions, so it's just natural that the evolution is very slow. But things really pick up after 94. That's videos. That's when you can see the Brazilians taking off ahead of the Japanese.
When I think about that, when I read a little bit about the Carlos Gracie Jr. Chapter, I thought a little bit about what you talked about just now, about how the events that they had in Brazil up to that point were very unorganized. What was the word you used? The Brazilian term they used. I thought it was kind of cool.
Jeitinho brasileiro.
Yeah, I thought that was kind of cool. That whole encompassing kind of like, maybe if you don't make weight, that's cool, no big deal. If you want to, if you want to be a little bit late, who cares? And for all his faults, and there is definitely some negative things that people talk about when they talk about Carlos Gracie. He has this whole systematic approach to Carlos Sr. When you talk about the entirety of the family, he had the Carlos Gracie, the Gracie diet. There was a bit of mysticism that people could talk about, right or wrong, but he was a very driven, focused, kind of almost, a little bit nuts kind of guy. But that focus, nuts is a harsh word. I don't mean to use that, but that focus is what brought jiu-jitsu into an actual organization. Because without that, who knows what happens? It could have just been some fluttering thing in the distance that ends up evaporating away into nothingness.
No, I agree. I think that Carlos was a very ambitious person. He was a very particular, unique kind of individual. I think there's no doubt about that. He was very. I mean, and if you read Hela's biography, his daughter writes. If you haven't read it, it's a very good read. I recommend people do read it. Even though like his story, there's a lot of inaccuracies, but it does paint a very vivid portrait of Carlos. And he's a very unique individual. He's very ambitious. He's more into diets and mysticism than he is into jiu-jitsu. That's what comes across to me. I mean, early in his early days, it's very clear that he is a jiu-jitsu man. And then later, slowly, he kind of passes on the torch to Helio Gracie, who kind of becomes the leader of the clan. Carlos is more in the background after, a certain period. But he's really into diets and mysticism. And I think he's an interesting guy. I mean, I don't agree with his methods. Like I say this very clearly in the book, but one way or another, had it been me, maybe let's say, suppose I were in his shoes and I acted differently. Let's say I did things differently. I don't think jiu-jitsu would exist. It was because they did things the way they did it that we are here. Yeah. And they did things in their own way. And it wasn't always pretty, but it got us here.
Yeah, and a lot of the brothers fractured off. George fractured off because he didn't want to deal with that whole structured philosophy. And George, and you talk about George Gracie, a lot of people, historians, believe that George Gracie was probably the greatest jiu-jitsu practitioner of all time. But people don't mention his name. Why? Because he didn't have that foundation in the society. He wasn't in charge of writing the history like Carlos would have been, because he didn't have that structure in his life.
Yeah, George wasn't in. I mean, he seemed like, I don't, obviously, we don't know that much about it, but what we do know is that he was very normal. That's why we don't remember. He was normal. Like, he would fight and then go drink a beer afterwards. Like, no, I don't want to eat like 30 oranges, back to back. Like, who does that? But that's the kind of Carlos would make his brothers and offspring do that. Like, this is the diet. This is how we train. This is how we do things. And he's referred to as a rebel by just about everyone who described him as a rebel. And I think it's interesting because, when he's not a rebel, he's just normal. It's just that Carlos had a very unique way of doing things, and it worked for them. It worked for us. But, had it been George there, we wouldn't exist right now. But George was just like a normal. He didn't want to follow the rules. He just was, I'm going to go live my life. No, I did not want to have 21 children. I like women, but I don't want to have 21 kids. What does that tell you? He's normal.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Normal. He wants to meet women, but he doesn't want to have 21 kids. Carlos was like, every time you have sex, you have a baby. That's sort of his approach to life. And, you have to admire the ambition. Like, there's no way around that. Like, the vision, the resilience, all of that really stands out. But I came to like George because, he was probably the most successful. He's the first hero of the Gracie family, right? Like, he kind of got neglected because he didn't have a lot of kids. And the narrative was largely told by Horian and Helio Gracie. And now Carlos Gracie gets his side of the story, but George never had his side of the story told. So that's one of the reasons why we wanted to put this together.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I haven't gotten that far in the book yet, so I don't want to get too ahead of ourselves. So let's start pivoting a little bit into the current topic, because not only are you a historian, you're also very relevant on the competition scene in the IBJJF. You've been competing at a high level for decades and decades, so you understand the implications of leg locks and foot locks into the IBJJF and how it changes the format and all the other things, and changes the dynamic of scoring and attacks and all the other things like that. But let's talk a few minutes about the elephant in the room. I talked a little bit about in the article. We've talked already previously about this. There's lots of speculation as to why leg locks have been deemed this evil thing. And I wrote a little bit about the Fada, Oswaldo Fada call out with the Gracie Academies, where he apparently the story goes, and again, you corrected me on this, but the oral history story from what I've heard is about leg locks were implemented by the Fadas, and then the Gracies decided what leg locks were bad because they lost the tournament due to the high levels of leg locks. And throughout history, now leg locks became this evil peasant what was the word you used, suburbia or whatever, the suburbia. Yeah, exactly. So tell me a little bit about what you feel about some of the reasons why throughout history leg locks have become this evil thing.
I think, we don't know exactly for sure where it comes from, but it's probably a combination of a variety of different factors. I think the main one is the same reason why Jigoro Kano excluded so much of the ground in judo. We like what we're good at. Jigoro Kano came from schools that emphasize takedowns more than they emphasize the ground, which says something about his expertise, right? So if I'm really good at takedowns, I want takedowns every day. That's what I like what I'm good at. What I'm not good at, I don't like. So people who aren't good at leg locks, what do they say about leg locks? Leg locks are stupid. That's not real jiu-jitsu, yada, yada, yada. People that don't know how to take someone down, all takedowns are stupid. That's not real jiu-jitsu, right? So like, we like real jiu-jitsu is whatever I like.
Right.
Whatever I happen to like and be good at, that's what real jiu-jitsu is. I suspect that it was something that they were not very familiar with. And then because of that, I'm not familiar with it, there's a bias against it. People are making rules a lot of times. They're not always as unbiased as they should be, in my opinion. Like when you're in head of a sport, whether it's the Kodokan or IBJJF, you have to look at things not from your perspective and what you like. You have to look at the sport as a whole. Like, what is the sport going to benefit from in the long run, right? Where some of these leaders might be going, I don't think this is happening today. I think today IBJJF has evolved a lot in that regard. But like maybe back in the day in the 50s, 60s, when they're formulating these rules, someone went along, you know what, I hate footlocks. I'm not good at them, and I don't want my students to lose tournaments. You know what? Like when it comes to a meeting and they're deciding the rules, his voice is against it because he's not very versed in them. And then he's worried that his students are going to lose competition. For example, I'm speculating here, but just give an idea of how these things occur. There is an association with the footlocks being suburban. You know, it's a derogatory term in Portuguese, suburbano, which means basically you're poor. It's a euphemism for being poor. So that's maybe where the association with the FADA Academy comes from. The event that everyone talks about the FADA cleaning house at the Gracie Academy, that really happened once. Normally, the Gracie Academy won. That was the norm. We got to be honest here. But there's that one time where the FADA's cleaned house. Like they won. We did the interview with FADA. We have an exclusive interview with FADA, by the way. It's in the book. So if you've never heard of little FADA give his voice, it's in the book. We have that. And we have the footage, too, of the interview, by the way. It's going to be in the documentary. But he basically said they win like 8 matches or something like that, a couple draws, and they had 1 loss, but they pretty much cleaned house, right? It doesn't say anything about footlocks. I mean, the Gracie family was versed in footlocks. They did have them. Like we know this, that they didn't know that they didn't use them. My suspicion is that the term, the prejudice comes more from luta livre. I don't know for sure, but the luta livre guys, luta livre is very similar to Brazilian jiu-jitsu in that it is at the crossroads between judo and catch wrestling. Right? Brazilian jiu-jitsu is the same, more judo than catch wrestling. Where luta livre was more the no-gi version of all of this. But Roberto Leitão, who's the father of Brazilian luta livre, he admitted to us that he started in judo with Takeo Yano, who we talk about in the book and the documentary. He basically, it got too hot. It was too hot in the Carioca, Rio de Janeiro summer. There's no air conditioning. So what do? They took their jackets off. You take your jacket off, it's no longer judo. Now it's lucha libre, or luta livre, as Brazilians say. Right?
Look at that. That's interesting.
That's why if you look at a lot of luta libre schools in Brazil, to this day, they practice with gi pants and belts because they never ceased from being judokas. They were always judokas. They just took their gis off. The thing is, they were so influenced by catch wrestling as well, right? That everyone's training with everyone during those days. Not so different than, like a 10th Planet, affiliate might train with an alliance gym. They're not practicing it exactly the same, but they still cross-train. Right. So the same thing was happening then.
Still jiu-jitsu. It's all jiu-jitsu variations in one way or another.
It's far more similarities than differences, right? People focus on the differences, but there are far more similarities than differences. And I suspect that the luta livre guys who have always practiced heel hooks, they were suburbanos. They were from the poor areas of Rio de Janeiro. That they were not in the South Zone, where all the wealth of Rio is. That's the upper classes are in the South Zone and the lower classes are in the suburbs. I think that's where it comes. It's more of a luta livre thing than a FADA thing. The FADA thing, I've never seen anything to confirm or not that the FADAs were specialists at footlocks. I think it's a myth, but there might be some. I've never seen anything that.
Right, and I only bring that up simply because there is this gray area involved where because there's footage of modern, or not modern, but like we call them old, but 90s tournaments, jiu-jitsu tournaments, where guys actually boo, 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 and they yell the Savata when guys go for footlocks, because it had this stigma against it, and because no one really understands, because the history of jiu-jitsu is so vague and not apparent. People were grasping at straws trying to figure out reasons why. And this seems to me like it would be some form of an oral history that maybe someone said, well, it was because of that, not even knowing. And just say, well, it's because of that FADA event. And, they use footlocks and they train lucha libre, which is bad because lucha libre isn't jiu-jitsu. And when in reality, it was just the two opposing forces coming at each other.
No, 100%. And it's probably most likely is just a myth, but there certainly was a pressure. I remember when I started training jiu-jitsu, it's been changing. You got to keep in mind, when I started training in 98. That's when I began training. If you went for a footlock, no one would stop you, but it was kind of like, bro, come on. Why would you do that? Right. It's kind of like if you're on someone's back and you're covering their mouth, like back in their Hosha, I did that one time. He's covering the dude's mouth, right? It's kind of like, you cross-face someone. You go, someone puts their chin down and you choke them with the jaw. It's not illegal, but it's like, really? You're going to do that? Come on. And that was sort of like the attitude people had towards footlocks. But that was slowly changing, because at some point people are asking the obvious questions. I'm like, wait a second, they're not illegal. I don't give a shit that you don't like it. They're working. Why are we not doing this, right? So when Comprito tapped Holeta, I think it was 99, the finals of the Absolute World Championship, that was a big moment for jiu-jitsu, because the toe holds had never been illegal. So this whole story about us ignoring half the body is nonsense. We never ignored half the body. We've always, we've been doing straight footlocks and knee bars and toe holds. They've always been legal, but they were very frowned upon. And, there's always been development in terms of toe holds, knee bars, and straight footlocks. But the heel hook adds a whole new dimension to everything, because now you're reaping, and the setups are not completely different, but they're different. And they add new elements, new layers to the leg lock discussion. And I think they enrich it. I think we shouldn't neglect it. But I think we mentioned this in conversation. I think one of the reasons why heel hooks were always made illegal is we forget that when these rules were formulated in the 1950s and 1960s, the knee reconstruction technology was not there. If you blew your knee with the heel hook, you were a cripple for life. The technology was not there. You'd be walking with a cane for the rest of your life. You'd be limping for the rest of your life. Whereas now we have the ability to reconstruct knees, and that changes things dramatically. So it's easier for us to say, it's not that big of a deal, where then it was like breaking your spine. It is a big deal. Right. So I understand why they did it. With that being said, I'm glad that IBJJF legalized them, because I think times have changed. I think there's been an education, and I think the submission-only movement is largely responsible and to think for this, of educating people that heel hooks are indeed dangerous. It is a short lever, and the repercussions are not the same of a popped elbow, right? You pop your elbow on an armbar, it's not that big of a deal. I've had it pop. 2 weeks later, you're back on the mat. You blow your knee with a heel hook, that's a different story. And it's a very short lever. There's not a lot of time to tap. With that being said, education has taught people to tap preemptively. Right. And so there is an element of risk there. So understand where the IBJJF and the people who are against heel hooks are coming from. But as the sport evolves and education is, everyone becomes more educated, I think it's for the best that we incorporate this arsenal into jiu-jitsu.
So let's talk about that a little bit, because again, I know people that are on the competition scene right now that are, there's still the guys that are like, screw the IBJJF. They hate the idea of a governing body. They hate the fact that the IBJJF has all these rules and regulations, and you got to sign all these, sign up forms and registration forms and blah, 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 blah. But that goes back to Carlos. If you get mad about all you want, but if that wasn't there, you probably wouldn't be training anyway. And I'll hold true to that with you on that. But I know several guys now that are up in arms, like, yes, heel hooks are legal. I'm going to go win me a world championship now because I'm a heel hook specialist, and these guys don't know anything about heel hooks. Yeah. And I think that to a certain degree, there are going to be some old school traditionalists that need to catch up to the curve. The guys that are more traditional, strict IBJJF guys that tend to do well and pop their head up, that focus solely on IBJJF, names that you don't necessarily see on the modern competition scene, but still excel in the IBJJF worlds because that's what they focus on. Like
Yeah.
they're going to have to work on things, beef their game up and change things around. But I think on the majority, when I watch the evolution of jiu-jitsu, particularly professional competitive jiu-jitsu, like the idea of having a superpower because you're a leg lock guy isn't really there anymore. Like guys are starting to understand the leg lock game, and they understand that that's a part of what they have to focus on. They understand that that's what has to happen. Like they know how to beat the knee line and how to do the right things to get out of leg locks. Tell me about what you think the impacts of heel hooks will have on the IBJJF with that in mind.
I think it's going to take 2 years for it to be part of the arsenal, just like any other move. There's no boogeyman. There's nothing extraordinary. I've been hearing this time the revolution is forever. I've been hearing that since I was a blue belt. When people started doing like, you know, De La Hiva and spider guard and half guard, I had like 3 open guard sweeps. I'm like, I know jiu-jitsu, man. I got spider guard sweeps. How many do you know? I know 3. You know, and there was this next moment where like people start, you know, just picking up. The half guard turns into deep half guard, and that turns into X guard, and it turns into, you know, I got 50-50 and then during both. And there's always like something new that people think, now I got modern jiu-jitsu. And then 2 years go by, 3 years go by. It's like, just another move like anyone else. And something else comes along, right? Or sometimes they go back full circle. Now we're seeing passing on your knees and making a comeback, which is something that had disappeared for over 20 years in jiu-jitsu. No one was passing on their knees. And it's making a comeback as a reaction to the single X and the De La Hiva, which is interesting. But I think it's just, there's no boogeyman. I think that guys who are leg lock specialists, they will walk into the IBJJF next No-Gi World Championship with mixed results. I'm not going to just win, because a lot of them come from submission only. And one huge flaw in submission only is that they don't really fight for position, which is the opposite of what a martial art should be, because there's a misconception they have in terms of what jiu-jitsu is, in my opinion at least. Jiu-jitsu to me is a martial art prior to it being a sport. And in a martial art, positioning is important, where if I'm on top or bottom in a real fight does make a difference. Don't just watch the UFC, draw your own conclusions. Being on top is an advantage. Being able to take someone down and hold them down and sweep them and hold them down. A mount is a dominant position in a fight. So these things are important. So I think a lot of the submission-only experts will go in there. They're going to do well, but they're going to lose a lot too, because they're not going to be able to stop a takedown or a sweep. Because they're not. I train with some of my students are very submission-only oriented, and they're all like all about the submission. And when I train with them, I realize that they don't defend sweeps. It's very easy to sweep them. I'm like, man, you're not even trying to stop me. I'm like, okay, but this is what's going to happen when you compete at ECC. You have 2 points scored on you, and that you know, and then you have to. So there's no contradiction. This is my beef with the submission only movement. It's like in politics. You have one guy in power, and then no one likes this guy. That's what happened in Brazil, right? Workers' Party is in power. No one likes this guy. So what do they do to solve the problem? Well, if this guy is bad, then the opposite is what's good. Right? That's sort of like how the human mind works. And it's not always the case. So people swing the other way. So submission only, by solving some problems, and they did solve some problems, they created all these other problems. So instead of, okay, advantages are a pain in the ass. Yeah, no one likes that. But to remove points entirely is like going like, whoa, that wasn't necessary either, man. Like fighting for top position is important in a fight. And that's the martial aspect that I feel that they're going to lose unless they make these adaptations. Now, IBJJF pulled off a stroke of genius, if you ask me, because now they incorporate what was missing. And now tell me what's missing now. What is it that, you know, someone from exclusively some submission-only tournaments do or trains that isn't part of the IBJJF arsenal? I can't think of anything, right? So now we saw the problem's been solved. And I do think it's for the better. I think that for all our differences, and I can make my criticisms of IBJJF as well. I think for the longevity of the sport, they are the governing body, and we have to get behind them. I think that for the if we want to be the most practiced martial art in the world, if we want to be judo, we need our Kodokan, and they are it. Now, there's one more thing, just because people think that they're so authoritarian and all that. There's some truth to that, because they have to be. They are the governing body. But at the same time, they're very open to discussion. Like, I've sat down with them many times, and if you present your arguments in a serious, you know, polite way, they listen. Like, I've been part of meetings that change jiu-jitsu rules, where you're discussing changing the rules to make the sport better. And they're not making decisions because they think it's best. They're listening to everyone. Like, what do the instructors have to say? What do they think? When they legalized heel hooks, that wasn't a decision they made. They reached out to 100 instructors out there and like, what do you guys think? And all these instructors, I know because they reached out to me. And I'm going, this is what I think. And this is why I think this is what's going to happen if you guys don't legalize it. This is what's going to happen if you do legalize it. And it was overwhelming in favor of legalizing. from, there's only one person, I'm not going to mention his name, but there's only one person who's a friend of mine that was against it. Everyone else was in favor. And I think that speaks volumes about what the community wants. So it was like a unanimous. It wasn't really an IBJJF decision. It was a decision that coaches within the IBJJF made. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's an interesting distinction. And that's something that a lot of people don't really think about. Again, there's this whole idea, and again, we could debate, and believe me, there's some solid points to say that the IBJJF have this kind of like iron-fisted rule over jiu-jitsu. Guys like to talk about, well, why do I care about winning a $5 gold medal when I can get paid 10 grand to go fight on a big stage, which is nice, but like not everybody's getting paid 10 grand. There's only very few that are getting paid 10 grand. Trust me, I've competed a whole lot on professional cards and made gas money to get down to Miami and back from Tampa. It ain't the luxurious lifestyle you want to think it is, brother. Right? But the idea is that the IBJJF, they listen to people, and to hear them say that they went out and they said, hey, look, we want to think about making a change. We want other people to come involved, and they're not stuck in this whole dogmatic position of like, no, this is the way it is because we're the IBJJF, and leg locks will never be legal because that's it. God has spoken. Let's move on. It's refreshing to hear that. Yeah.
We're very open to discussion. Like, I've been one of the earliest proponents of legalizing leg locks. About 5 years ago when this whole thing started, right, I was calling it, like, not to toot my own horn, but I was calling that what was going to happen is exactly what's been happening. And like, this is what's going to happen. This is how submission only guys are going to train jiu-jitsu. And this is how they're going to get good at. They're going to get good at butt scooting and leg locks from the bottom. They're not going to wrestle because it makes no tactical sense to wrestle, right? And IBJJF, these guys are going to get surprised when they go to ADCC or when they're rolling in the gym because they're not going to be equipped to defend it. And, it wasn't just me, but like, I think that they listen. Like, so that was all my point is that if you present, not just going, oh, you guys suck because, something, no, present the arguments intelligently, right? And make a point and say, and as long as your north is the same as theirs, it's like, let's do what's best for the sport overall and the longevity of the sport and all practitioners, not just some practitioners, but all practitioners. And let's make jiu-jitsu the most practiced martial art in the world, right? Which is what I'm in favor of. Then I think they're very keen to listen to anyone. But, you got to do it in a way that's not trolling. And I think that's part of the problem. A lot of the critics, they're not really criticizing. They're just trolling. They're just hating. You have to be like, just be smart about it. Be polite, be educated, be reasonable. And I think they're more than willing to listen.
Well, what I've noticed in the trends of jiu-jitsu over the last 3 or 4 years, particularly since the last ADCC trials in particular, you're seeing guys that were these submission only guys and guys that were these points only guys understand now that submission only and positional jiu-jitsu is part of the same thing. Like, you're seeing these hybridizations of competitors now where they realize the importance of hunting for submissions because, hey, if I get a submission, game over. I ain't got to do nothing else. But they also understand that we have to compete. And in order to win in a competition, I have to understand the aspects of passing the guard. I have to understand the aspects of wrestling. Wrestling in particular is what I've seen quite a bit of. Sweeping is still kind of maybe. Guys are still trying to attack more from their guard. I think the submission-only guys are not worrying about his sweeps as much. But they're very understanding of, hey, if I want to succeed on the big stage, I have to understand that my game is a combination of both aspects. I don't think there's much guys anymore that are like, if you're just a submission guy, if you're just a points guy, like, you're just not really you're not accepting all the aspects of the avenues that jiu-jitsu has to offer.
I think that you're absolutely correct. I think that everything needs to be incorporated. Like, I think it's a huge mistake to can positioning. It's all about the submission. That's not true. But I do agree that IBJJF has become overly tactical. It's allowing people who aren't that good at jiu-jitsu to win because they just know the rules inside out. It's become so bureaucratic. And judo, I worry that they make the same mistakes judo makes. I think judo is such an interesting sport to me for a variety of reasons. There are things that I envy judo about. Like, I talk about this in the book. I learned to envy judo in so many ways, but they have some gaps in their line of thinking. Like, at least when it comes to a sport as well, at least, it's too limiting. Like, they stop the fight all the time. Like, guys, that's not how combat takes place. You can't be stopping the fight all the time. It goes out of bounds. Okay, but other than that, why do you keep interrupting the fight? You know, you have to let it develop. And I think jiu-jitsu is a little more, we have less, we were less likely to stop the fight, like in judo, for example. But I worry that making it too tactical is going to ruin the sport. Like, that's a concern I have. I've always made, just like I've made a case for heel hooks, I've always said that there's one particular position that I disapprove of. It's the lapel from 50-50. There's one way of you wrap the guy's leg in the 50-50 with the lapel, and you hide your hand underneath his knee. You can't break that grip. I've had blue belts hold me there, and I can't move. It's a nightmare. I'm sure that, I don't know. Maybe like,
I know exactly the grip you're talking about. It's a pain in the ass.
I know, maybe like, Paul Lumiao or Keenan Cornelius has a way of breaking. Like, I don't know. I can't even barely touch your hand. I'm going to break that grip, and I'm stuck. And an average blue belt can hold me there. And he's not really progressing. He's not really sweeping or even close to a submission. So what exactly is he doing? So this is where, like, I think that they have to apply more criteria for stalling, because they're not always, they apply in some situations and they're good at it. And then in others, they're like, oh, the guy might sweep. Well, he's not. Like, look at what's happened. He's not even trying to sweep, right? And it's allowing guys that are not good at jiu-jitsu actually win, because they're just good strategists and they know the rules inside out. And I don't like that. To me, the approach I've always had to jiu-jitsu was a combat one. The North is combat. It's not a medal, it's combat. What would work in a fight? And this is why positions like mount and side control are important, because in a fight, those would be dominant positions. Turtle position should be points. Turtle position is the best position in a fight, better than mount. Don't believe me, watch the UFC. How many TKOs do you see from mount? How many TKOs do you see from turtle? Turtle should be more points than mount. Because in turtle, I can really mess you up in a fight.
Right.
It's the North. It's combat. It's not sport. And if we keep moving towards, you have to balance things. It can't be MMA. I understand that. But you have to be looking, what is most efficient for the martial art in terms of combat? That's what made jiu-jitsu the fastest growing martial art in the world. It was the fact that it was so combat oriented. Right, that was the big difference between judo and jiu-jitsu is that judo is very sport-oriented. Brazilian jiu-jitsu came from a combat background. Let's keep it that way. So it's important not to lose that North. That's my biggest. If it's the limiting of the arsenal and the matches that are overly tactical. Like, these are the things that we have to look into tweaking in the future to make jiu-jitsu, keep it fun, keep it entertaining, keep it sport as well, but not lose that martial practice.
Yeah, and I think the biggest thing, and this is what I always talk about when I hear guys talk about, and this debate isn't really as prevalent anymore, but it still pops its head up every once in a while when you talk about guys that say things like, well, submission only is what true jiu-jitsu is, because you're fighting to an end game, as opposed to, positional jiu-jitsu is just hold and pray and stuff. But, when we talk about what more closely represents the reality of what combat would be, I think that sometimes the idea of submission only grappling as being the end all be all whose jiu-jitsu is better is a bit misleading. And it's about the same ideas of, if I'm in an actual altercation where I have to defend myself against an attacker, like, I'm not going to sit in their guard and try to look for a leg lock. I'm going to pass the guard. I'm going to put knee on belly. I'm going to work to progress the positions up the hierarchy of what jiu-jitsu's progressions are. And when you talk about points grappling, that's exactly what happens. It's just the Danaher principle. You take them down, you get past the legs. Now you pass the legs. Now you advance the position up, on so on and so forth, to where my opponent has less and less options to attack me, and I have more control.
Yeah, no, I agree 100%. It's I guess any martial art has always been, it's always in a state of evolution. Judo, I just learned yesterday, I didn't know this, that judo allowed for more recently, like in the last few years, they allowed for more time on the ground. I'm convinced that's an influence of Brazilian jiu-jitsu. They saw, like, okay, these guys actually are doing something right. So they're tweaking the rules to adjust to the public perception, like what people are wanting, because people want more groundwork, right? Because it's fun, it's rich. So,
and they're more understanding of the aspects of that, because of the new MMA and UFC and all things like that.
So just give an example. I know this for a fact, because the first time I went to France is very judo dominant, right? The first time I went to France was, I think, 2005. And I remember them telling me that the Judo Federation in France is so strong, they're so powerful, they're so influential at the government level, that they don't allow MMA or Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. There are no Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu tournaments in France, right? And they didn't allow MMA either, because the Judo Federation just had a rap on it. They wouldn't allow it. Think about that. That's like some like Joseph Stalin level shit, man. You can't put on a jiu-jitsu tournament? Are you kidding me? Right? And then
the French are in defense of the French, they are a little bit uppity about their thing.
Like it's incredibly authoritarian, but like they that's how it's always been. But recently, the Judo Federation in France started organizing Niwaza tournaments, which I think is great because they're basically Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu tournaments.
Right.
Even though Niwaza, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is Niwaza, like one predates the other. I understand that, but I do think it's interesting that they had to concede that there was something missing, and the public was reacting to that. What was missing? They wanted that. That is exactly the niche that the Gracie family, largely the Gracie family, not just them, but largely them, carved out of Kodokan's judo. They neglected it, and now they're making a comeback. Like, oh, you know what? It was very rich. Why did we leave that behind? Yuki Nakai was probably one of my favorite interviews in the book. He talks about this, like the nostalgia of having it come back when Japan had neglected it after the war. Like it died after the war. It was completely dead. And then it was always there, but they never saw the value in it had it not been reversed and ported back to them. So now Yuki Nakai is the Japanese president of the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu Federation.
That's interesting. And again, I love that cycle. I love the idea, like, because these are things that I understood in a blanket kind of way, but I still had this division between judo and jiu-jitsu and thought of them as two separate arts. I still thought of like judo is judo and jiu-jitsu is jiu-jitsu. And I always knew that jiu-jitsu predated judo, but I didn't really understand what it all meant. And now when we understand what it means and understand how, jiu-jitsu was dying out because of the war, and then, Kano decided to make jiu-jitsu what it is, or judo what it is, to make it more relevant to reality and without having to be combative and blah, 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 blah. The Brazilian took over because the Japanese came over. It's so cool to see how it all kind of came together.
Yeah, it's the story of globalization, right? Like, and like this is all like I think it comes across in the book, because I talk a lot about this. Like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is Brazil's main cultural export. Like it's a Japanese art. It's not BJJ or AJJ. It really should be JJJ, right? Because it's really something Japanese. It's just they've accepted it. The world's adapted and changed, primarily culturally. But this art goes to Brazil. It has a makeover in Brazil, and then it comes to the U.S. and it is suffering a makeover. And we're watching the process happen. The culture of jiu-jitsu in the United States has changed it dramatically. Like we're watching a second makeover of jiu-jitsu. Now it's back in Japan. And it's very interesting to me to see how the Japanese react to all of this. And they're incredibly humble about it. That's what's so interesting to me, because you do see, I think that I think Brazilians are more defensive of this than the Japanese are, for example. And the Japanese are just simply okay with calling it Brazilian jiu-jitsu, which is and they have a better case than Brazilians or Americans.
To say that they invented the art, because in reality they did. It just transferred over to Brazil, and and I'll even do you one better. Like based upon the modernization of jiu-jitsu, I would even stand on to say, and this is Brazilians, I might get some hate mail from this when I see my Brazilian friends. I would even beg to say that Americans have done a significant amount to change the art of jiu-jitsu over the last 15 years. In the United States, 10 years, we'll call it, in the United States, by evolving it into what it has become today. I mean, there's still Brazilians that dominate, but I imagine that the fact that it has become Americanized through the UFC, and there's American practitioners that have made innovations with catch wrestlers and all the other different philosophies. I would go on to say that I think Americans have changed jiu-jitsu a lot too.
I think that everyone who's trained jiu-jitsu is changing. If who's training is changing jiu-jitsu. Even if you're a white belt, you're affecting the art in a very small way. Everyone's affecting it. I think that, and I write about this in the book too. Like it's innovation has always been going on. It's not that there was no innovation in the 40s, 50s, 70s, and 80s. There was always innovation. The thing is, when you have few practitioners, few competitions, and you don't have the internet, the transferring of information is very, very slow, because you don't have a lot of people to spread it. You don't have a lot of competitions to battle test it. And it's all word of mouth, right? Like people don't even have cameras in those days. Unless you're a TV crew, you don't have a camera. How do you spread information? So what happened is the jiu-jitsu boom took place in the United States at a time where, the internet and social media blew up. And we've never had so many tournaments. If you're willing to travel, you compete every week in the United States. When I left the United States in end of 2000, beginning of 2001 to go back to Brazil, there were 2 tournaments, and I was in Las Vegas, and that's in all of California. There were 2 tournaments a year. It was the Joe Moreira Invitational and the Copa Pacifica, organized by Kleber Luciano. That was it. If we wanted to compete more, we had to enter judo tournaments, 2 tournaments a year, right? And that's in 2001. Come back, fast forward 20 years, and you compete every weekend. So, and I think that the combination of many tournaments, many competitors, and the internet accelerates the evolution. Obviously, I don't think this has anything to do with, where you happen to be born, but it does say something about where the sport is. Southern California has become the new Rio de Janeiro. It has become the mecca of the sport because all the competitions are there. It is natural that all the good competitors are going to flock to that region. All the best competitors are in that region. What's the consequence of that? More technical evolution, compounded by the internet, compounded by all the competitions, compounded by all these practitioners going to war every weekend. So we're watching, it's like technology. Technology, there's a curve. I forget the name of the curve, but like how technology builds on itself and it just rises exponentially. There's a name for that, like a theory from the 70s, I think. And the guy's like, look, technology builds on itself and this is what's going to happen, right? And we're watching that. I think it's the same thing with jiu-jitsu.
Compound effect is the one I think I was probably going to say, but
it builds on itself, right? And this doesn't, when does it stop? I hope it never does.
Right. I agree. And when I think about the evolution of early jiu-jitsu, and I think about where we are now, I think about what I always love to talk about when I talk about jiu-jitsu is this ever-changing organic thing. It happens all on its own. It has a life of its own. And you could talk about Carlos again when we talk about his mysticism. To a certain extent, there is a lot of mysticism in jiu-jitsu. Like, I believe in the power of jiu-jitsu as something more than just some art form where I go here, 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 and here. Because, like, again, if I'm going to do a Kimura, like, I'm going to show a Kimura different than the way you show a Kimura, and the different than the way another black belt I know is going to show a Kimura, because it's going to be the same technique, but we're going to emphasize different ideas. We're going to emphasize different ways we twist the wrist, different ways. Some guys use the thumb. Some guys use no thumb when they grab the wrist. So it kind of grows on its own and becomes its own thing. And I love that about jiu-jitsu. It's something that I think hold to my heart.
The most enticing thing about jiu-jitsu perhaps is not the technique. Maybe it's a combination. Maybe it's both, but I think it's the culture too. I'm critical of that culture in some ways because it's a surf culture. I call it the Hakuna Matata culture, right? The average Brazilian jiu-jitsu practitioner, he's like that Pumbaa in Lion King. Like, he just
I'm definitely a Pumbaa, Rob. Don't give me too much shit.
Wearing like jeans, like I'm normally in board shorts and flip-flops, and I'm 39 years old and I dress like I'm 14.
Right.
But, and I think it's that culture is a very happy culture. I was talking to a CDMO, one of the heads of the IBJJF, and he goes like this, and he goes like, he calls jiu-jitsu like the third place, right? I think he picked up that from the guy the guy who founded Starbucks. The first place is home, second place is work. You got to go home, you got to go to work. The third place is where you choose to be. So the guy who created Starbucks, apparently he wanted to make Starbucks that place. Like, you're there because you want to be there. So it has to be a pleasant experience. And I think jiu-jitsu gyms have become that third place for a lot of people. And that's what's so, because the energy is, I never practiced other martial arts other than Hapkido when I was very young. But I'm under the impression that there's something about, and I think Brazilians play a role here because it is a very laid back culture. It is a do it later culture. If you're 10 minutes late, it's not a big deal. It's sort of like, chill, bro, like have fun first, and there's some of that lingered in BJJ for good and for better, for worse. Like, it comes with good and it comes with bad, right? And I know this because I'm half Brazilian. I grew up in Brazil. I know this perfectly well. It can be enraging, the fact that no one understands that 5 o'clock means 5 o'clock. But at the same time, they're very, very, they just know how to live life happy. Like, they're just very happy people. Depression rates are very low in Brazil compared to like most Western countries. Like, it's not, they're very chill. It comes with bad too. Like, that lack of that Hakuna Matata philosophy comes with problems, but it's very ingrained in the Brazilian jiu-jitsu culture. Like, you go to Australia or Chechnya, you go to, you name it, you're gonna find that there's that acai after the rolling, the fist bump. It's that, what's up, bro? The hugging, the joking. You don't joke around with people like that in other martial arts. Like, they're constantly making fun of each other. Like, there's no full on, like, stop in the middle of class to make fun of each other for 15 minutes. And then they're done making fun of each other and they go back to training. It is a very laid back culture. And I think that is one of the reasons, not the only reason, that, people really fall in love with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu.
That's cool, man. So one last question. This is something that we can end on to talk about the relevance of the IBJJF in modern competing and the ideas of leg locks incorporated and blah, 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 blah. So one of the biggest things that I hear these modern competitors talk about is like, the idea of like, well, why do I give a care about going to pay the IBJJF to go compete so I could win some $5 medal to go out and be on top? There's no money in it for me. I'm getting paid to do this. I'm getting paid to do that. Like, why do I care about that? And, I have a particular answer because, my belief is that no matter what you say, the IBJJF is you're not a world champion until you win in the IBJJF as a world champion. I don't care what anybody says. The ADCC is awesome, and I think that's the one that the fighters want to win. But if you want to be a world champion, you have to win in the 80s. You have to win in the IBJJFs. What do you say to fighters that take this approach of flippancy of like, who cares about the IBJJF anyway?
First of all, I don't think fighters fight for money. That's not true. Fighters fight for prestige, for honor, for glory. That's why we fight. No one fights for money. Because if money is really your thing, you should go to Wall Street. You shouldn't be doing jiu-jitsu. And that's advice I give my students. If you really is money that you're after, that's what you dream of. When you go to bed at night, you go to Wall Street, real estate, land developer, construction, do something else, bro. Like a technology, go to Silicon Valley, figure it out. That's where the money is. Speculation. That's, financing. That's where the money. Jiu-jitsu, I mean, yeah, if you're like top 1%, you're going to be okay. You're not going to be rich. No one's rich in jiu-jitsu other than like 3 people in the world are actually rich from jiu-jitsu. It's a myth. That's not why we do what we do. I think a lot of times that's an excuse. I really think it is. Look at the Olympics, the most prestigious organization on the planet. Do they pay? They give you a medal. Okay, it's a gold medal, but no one sells it. It's not like it's worth. I mean, you could sell it, I suppose, but people don't. It's not why your dream is to go to the Olympics. You are dreaming of the glory. There's nothing wrong with that. It's the prestige. I don't buy it, to be honest. I think that this is what's funny too. Like, no one gives the Olympics shit for not paying. They have way more money than IBJJF. I've never seen the people who are critical of the IBJJF get mad at the Olympics because they don't pay their athletes. They have way more money than the IBJJF or the UFC for that matter. Even though it's different, it's a professional organization, but the UFC makes 1,000 times more money than the IBJJF. I don't see people giving Dana White a hard time over that. I mean, the same people, because if you're going to be critical of one, you have to be critical of the other. Why doesn't he pay the fighters more? I'm not saying, that there are things they couldn't do to do more for the athletes, but for the most part, that's standard in business. Like, it's not that they are a business. It's not like they're running a charity. Like, there's a business that's private, just like the Olympics. It's private, just like the UFC. It's a private organization. It's aimed at making money. With that being said, are they all about money? I'll give you an example, because I made that point with them once, and this is what they told me. It's a very good point. They called me on my bullshit. They basically go like this: look, Rob, you know how much more money? Like, one of your suggestions is to make the matches shorter, which I've always said. I've always believed that the match 10 minutes is too long. I think 7 is good. 6, 7. I think that's a better time limit for black belts. And they say, if we took your suggestion, you know how much more money we would make if we were all about the money? Just by shortening the matches, you know how many more people we can get in here? Instead of having a bunch of 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 8 and 10 minutes, if we just made every match 6 minutes, we could probably add another 400 competitors here per tournament. At a big one, like the Pan Ams, for example, right? We would make way more money, but we don't do that because we believe that more time means more time for the fight to develop. So to say that they're only about the money is very unfair. They are an organization aimed at profit. Of course they are. So is my gym, right? But to say that's the only thing they care about, I think that's very, very, very unfair depiction of what they are and what they have done for the sport.
Yeah, I'll leave it at this, and this is just my final word on it. And you can add to it if you like at the end. But like, people that don't get this kind of upset me with the world. Maybe I'm old. Maybe I like to be my old man and shake my fist at the air. But there's more things in life than money, you know. And I'm easy to say to that. Maybe I've accepted the fact that I don't have money and whatever it is. But like, I truly believe that, when you get into an endeavor in the combative atmosphere, you're doing it because you have something more in mind than just going out and getting rich and fame and fortune. When I get on a competition mat against someone for a gold medal or for whatever I'm doing it because there's this joy of the competition. There's this joy of knowing that I put the hard work in. I drove myself to get to the point where I could even make it to this match. And now I'm competing against someone that did the same in the same atmosphere to try to fight with that person tooth and nail to get what I want, which is a $5 medal. But
it's not a $5.
Yeah.
I'm right. Sorry. Yeah.
But it means more to me than just something I hang on the wall. It means to me that, you know what, I don't care what anybody says. Like, I did something. This is something that I did, and it means something to me. And like the one thing I hate more than anything, and it makes me crazy with modern jiu-jitsu, is these guys, they have these ideas of like, yeah, I'm this, I'm that, and they miss the point. They miss that point of what makes jiu-jitsu great, because it falls back into the whole beautiful thing that is the mysticism of jiu-jitsu, and that just makes me sad to see the sport go that way.
It is sad, and you know what? Don't take my word for it. Rob is okay. Rob is not rich. That's why he's saying that. That's right. I mean, I'm with you. There are more important things in life. Ask your grandpa. Ask your great grandpa who's in his deathbed. Ask someone who's lived their life. And I did this with these grandmasters. And I did this, and they taught me so much. That was a real lesson, man. This documentary was not a jiu-jitsu lesson. It was a life lesson. These guys had some wisdom, man. Like, I don't know why anyone is listening to why these 23-year-old kids have to say, I'm sorry. When you're 23, I don't care how good you are at jiu-jitsu. You don't know shit about shit.
Shit.
You don't know how the meme go. You don't know shit about fuck. Right? That's their 24-year-old, you know.
You learn to be really good at something, and you pretty much found a bag of money. I'm happy for you. I'm glad, but don't act like you reinvented the wheel, or you built Google up or something like that. Yeah. You know, you're playing a game and you're getting paid to do it.
You're just dropping like wisdom bombs on me left, right, and center, and the message they tell, yeah, it's not all about them. It's not, we don't like it, but you're right. There are other things in like there's things that are more important. And if someone is in their 80s and they lived through life and they've had money and they lost money and they've had money again and they've been through all that and they're telling you that, I think that says something.
Yeah, man. Well, Rob, dude, I think I'm gonna let you go, man. I appreciate your time because you're awesome. Like I really, really love your book. It's going to take me, like I said, forever and a day to read it because I'm horrible and slow. But I am dedicated to cranking it out. And when I do crank it out, we will have you on to discuss it in entirety so I can have a more educated conversation with you, because I still am slightly in the dark about the true history. And when I finish this, I believe I'll be more on par with to have a good conversation with you about that. But I appreciate your insights on the IBJJF, on leg locks, and in the future, because you have something to say and your words should matter. And if people out there watching, you should listen to guys like Rob, because he is what you should strive to be. And I appreciate your time and blah 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 blah. Got anything else you want to say before we go?
No, man. Just thank you for the opportunity, and appreciate the opportunity to be here. And we'll do this again, man. It was fun. Thank you for the kind words, man. It means a lot. Thank you.
Yeah, man. You Rob. I mean, I'm not even kissing. I mean it. You're amazing. Thank you for being you, brother. All right, man. I'm going to go ahead and call it. This has been Kevin Gallagher with Robert Drysdale on the Aces Jiu-Jitsu Club podcast. You guys enjoy it, man. Go read some articles and take it easy, man. We'll see you.
Ciao.